For 28 years, I was a respected elder in Jehovah's Witnesses, a leader, a spiritual shepherd, admired by hundreds. But the moment I dared to question a single doctrine, I was no longer a brother. I became Satan himself in their eyes. What they did to me, and what they're still doing to others who dare to think, will leave you shocked. My name is Thomas Mitchell, and for 28 years I served as an elder in the Jehovah's Witnesses organization. 28 years of my life dedicated to what I believed was God's earthly organization. I thought I was serving the Almighty, protecting His flock, guiding souls towards salvation. I wore that title like a badge of honor, respected by hundreds of congregants who looked up to me as their spiritual shepherd. But let me tell you something that will chill you to the bone. The moment you dare to question even the smallest doctrine, even whisper a doubt about their teachings, you become the enemy overnight. Not just any enemy, but Satan himself walking among them. I'm 72 years old now, sitting in my small apartment in Portland, Oregon, far from the Kingdom Hall where I once delivered sermons to packed audiences. My hair has turned completely white. My hands shake a bit when I hold my coffee cup, but my memory is sharp as a razor when it comes to what happened to me 5 years ago. What they did to me. What they're still doing to others who dare to think for themselves. You see, folks, I wasn't some troublemaker or rebellious member. I was the model elder. I conducted Bible studies, gave public talks, served on judicial committees that decided the spiritual fate of congregation members. I was the one they called when families needed counseling, when young people strayed from the path, when difficult decisions had to be made. For nearly 3 decades, I believed with every fiber of my being that the governing body in Brooklyn received direct revelation from God. I defended their ever-changing doctrine, their flip-flopping teachings, their increasingly controlling demands on members' lives. But something happened in the spring of 2019 that changed everything. It started small, like a tiny crack in a dam that eventually brings down the entire structure. I was studying for a Watchtower lesson about the 1914 doctrine. You know, their teaching that Christ's invisible presence began in that year, that the last days started then, that their organization was chosen as God's sole channel of communication on earth. I'd taught this doctrine hundreds of times, but that day, something felt off. I decided to do what any honest student would do. I researched. Not just their publications, but historical sources, archaeological evidence, biblical scholarship. What I found shook me to my core. The date 1914 wasn't based on solid biblical interpretation at all. It was built on a foundation of failed predictions, mathematical gymnastics, and desperate attempts to maintain credibility after previous end-times prophecies had failed miserably. Charles Taze Russell, their first president, had originally predicted 1874, then 1914, then his successor Joseph Rutherford moved it to 1925, and when that failed, they created this elaborate mythology around 1914 being an invisible event that nobody could verify. The more I researched, the more disturbed I became. Their blood doctrine, which had cost thousands of lives based on a misinterpretation of Old Testament dietary laws. Their disfellowshipping practices that destroyed families, nowhere commanded in Scripture for the offenses they applied it to. Their claim to be God's only organization, contradicted by Jesus' own words about not lording over others. Their governing body's claim to be the faithful and discreet slave, a parable that Jesus never said applied to any human organization. I spent months in agonizing prayer and study. I wanted so desperately to be wrong. This organization had been my life, my identity, my entire social world. My wife Sarah had been a faithful witness for 35 years. My 2 sons, Marcus and David, were both ministerial servants working their way up the organizational ladder. My daughter Emma was a pioneer, spending 70 hours a month in door-to-door preaching. Our entire extended family, our closest friends, everyone we knew and loved was part of this organization. To question it meant potentially losing everything, but I couldn't live with the lie anymore. I couldn't stand at that podium and teach doctrines I knew were false. I couldn't participate in judicial committees that destroyed people's lives based on man-made rules disguised as biblical commands. My conscience, which the organization claimed to respect, was screaming at me to speak up. I decided to start carefully. I began asking questions during elders' meetings, not challenging, just inquiring. "Brother Anderson," I would say to our presiding overseer, "I've been studying the 607 BCE chronology, and I'm having trouble reconciling it with the historical evidence. Could you help me understand how we maintain this date when every archaeological source places Jerusalem's destruction in 587 BCE? Audrey, I've been reading the context of Matthew 24:45-47, and I'm wondering how we can be certain this parable applies to a governing body when Jesus was simply illustrating the need for faithfulness among all his followers." The change in their demeanor was immediate and chilling. These men, who had been my closest friends and fellow workers for decades, suddenly looked at me with suspicion. Brother Anderson's face would harden whenever I asked questions. Brother Williams would exchange meaningful glances with others when I spoke. The warm fellowship that had characterized our meetings for years turned cold and tense. Within weeks, I noticed I was being excluded from certain discussions. Meetings would end abruptly when I arrived. Conversations would stop when I walked into a room. I wasn't being invited to the informal gatherings that elders regularly attended. My assignments started becoming fewer and less significant. Where I once gave the closing prayer for circuit assemblies, now I was assigned to handle microphones. The isolation was subtle at first, but steadily intensified. Sarah began receiving calls from other elders' wives, concerned about my spiritual health. They would ask if I was reading apostate material or if I was struggling with doubts. The questions were posed as loving concern, but Sarah could sense the underlying suspicion. She started looking at me differently too, watching my behavior and questioning my motives when I spent time studying. Then came the home visit. Brother Anderson and Brother Collins, both senior elders in our circuit, knocked on our door one evening in October 2019. They said they wanted to have an encouraging discussion about some concerns that had been raised. Sarah served coffee and cookies, trying to maintain the warm atmosphere these visits had always had in the past, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Brother Mitchell," Anderson began, his voice carrying an authority I'd heard. "Him use with wayward congregation members. We've noticed some changes in your attitude lately. Some of your questions suggest you might be allowing Satan to plant seeds of doubt in your mind about God's organization. We're here as your loving brothers to help you regain your spiritual balance." I felt my heart racing, but I tried to remain calm. "Brothers, I appreciate your concern, but asking questions about our teachings isn't the same as doubting God. Even the Bereans were commended for examining the scriptures to verify what they were taught. Shouldn't we be able to discuss these matters openly?" Collins leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Brother, there's a difference between honest inquiry and the kind of critical thinking that leads to apostasy. The faithful and discreet slave has been appointed by Jehovah to provide spiritual food at the proper time. When we question their teachings, we're really questioning God himself." That phrase, critical thinking, spoken like it was a disease. These were men who had once praised my thoroughness in Bible study, who had commended my careful preparation for talks and articles. Now they were telling me that thinking too carefully about their doctrines was dangerous. The conversation continued for over 2 hours. They quoted extensively from Watchtower articles about the dangers of independent thinking, the need for loyalty to the organization, the fate of those who turn away from God's channel of communication. They spoke in the loving tones I'd heard them use countless times with struggling members, but underneath the gentleness was an unmistakable threat: conform or be destroyed. As they prepared to leave, Anderson placed his hand on my shoulder in what appeared to be a fatherly gesture. "Thomas," he said, using my first name instead of the formal Brother Mitchell he'd used throughout the evening, "we love you and your family, but love sometimes requires firm boundaries. We hope you'll prayerfully consider what we've discussed. Tonight, the next time we visit, we'll need to see evidence that you've adjusted your thinking. The organization is bigger than any one person, and it will continue with or without you." After they left, Sarah and I sat in our living room in stunned silence. She finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Tom, what have you gotten us into? These are men who've been our friends for decades. If they're this concerned, maybe you really are being influenced by something evil. Maybe you need to just trust the organization and stop digging so deep into things that are beyond our understanding." I looked at my wife of 43 years, this woman who had stood by my side through every challenge life had thrown at us, and I saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of God, but fear of the organization we had served so faithfully, fear of what would happen to our family, our reputation, our entire way of life if I continued down this path of honest inquiry. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized I was facing the most important decision of my life. I could submit, apologize for my questions, return to teaching doctrines I knew were false, and maintain the comfortable life we'd built within the organization. Or I could follow my conscience, continue seeking truth wherever it led, and potentially lose everything I'd ever known and loved. But deep down, I already knew which choice I would make. Once you've seen the man behind the curtain, once you've discovered that the emperor has no clothes, you can't unsee it. You can't unknow what you know. And I knew that the organization I'd devoted my life to was not what it claimed to be. I had no idea, lying there in the darkness, just how ruthless and systematic their campaign against me would become. The surveillance began within days of that visit. I first noticed it when I went to the grocery store on Thursday morning. Brother Peterson, an elder from the neighboring congregation, was there at the same time, unusual since he lived 15 miles away and there were 3 grocery stores closer to his home. He nodded politely but kept his distance, and I caught him watching me from the corner of my eye as I selected items from the shelves. When I moved to the checkout line, he abandoned his half-full cart and left the store immediately. 2 days later, I was filling my car with gas when Sister Rodriguez drove by slowly, craning her neck to see who I might be talking to. I was alone, just pumping gas, but she circled the block twice before finally driving away. At first, I thought these were coincidences. But when similar incidents happened repeatedly over the following weeks, I realized this was something far more sinister and organized. The pattern became clear during our next congregation meeting. I arrived a few minutes early, as was my habit, to help set up chairs and greet arriving members, but instead of the usual warm welcomes and friendly conversations I'd enjoyed for nearly 3 decades, I was met with polite but distant nods. People who had hugged me enthusiastically just weeks before now barely made eye contact. Families I'd conducted Bible studies with, couples whose marriages I'd counseled, young people I'd mentored, all treating me like I was carrying some contagious disease. Brother Williams approached me during the song intermission. "Tom," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard, "I need to let you know that your parts on the Theocratic Ministry School have been reassigned. Brother Anderson felt it would be best if you focused on your personal study. For a while, the Theocratic Ministry School, where I'd been giving presentations and training others for over 25 years. Being removed from it was like being stripped of my spiritual credentials in front of the entire congregation." After the meeting, I overheard Sister Thompson whispering to her daughter, Stay away from Brother Mitchell. The elders say he's been reading things he shouldn't, questioning the organization. We don't want his doubts affecting your faith. Her daughter, Rebecca, was a girl I'd baptized 3 years earlier, someone I'd watched grow from childhood into a dedicated young woman. Now her own mother was warning her against me as if I were a predator. The isolation intensified rapidly. Phone calls that used to come regularly from fellow elders about congregation matters stopped completely. My suggestions during service meetings were ignored or dismissed with comments like, "We appreciate your input, but the circuit overseer has given us clear direction on this matter." Invitations to social gatherings dried up. When congregation members saw me at restaurants or shopping centers, they would look away quickly or cross to the other side of the street. But it was what happened to my family that truly showed me the cruel efficiency of their system. Sarah began receiving calls from concerned sisters in the congregation. "We're worried about Tom," they would say. Some of the elders mentioned he might be struggling with his faith. "Is everything all right at home? Is he reading material he shouldn't be? We want to help, but we need to know what's really going on." These weren't friendly check-ins. They were intelligence-gathering missions. Each caller would ask specific questions. What books was I reading? What websites was I visiting? Had I been in contact with former witnesses? Was I expressing doubts about specific doctrines? Sarah, bless her heart, initially tried to defend me, but the constant pressure began wearing her down. She started questioning my motives, wondering if there was truth to their concerns. My sons, Marcus and David, both ambitious young men climbing the organizational ladder, began distancing themselves from me. Marcus called one evening, his voice strained. "Dad, Brother Anderson pulled me aside after the meeting tonight. He said you've been asking inappropriate questions about the organization, that you might be heading toward apostasy. He warned me that my spiritual progress could be affected if I don't take a firm stand for the truth." "Dad, what's going on? Are you really doubting Jehovah's organization?" The pain in his voice cut through me like a knife. Here was my own son, whom I'd raised in the faith, taught to love God and seek truth, now being used as a tool to pressure me into conformity. I tried to explain that I wasn't doubting God, only questioning whether the organization's interpretations were always correct. But Marcus had been well trained in organizational loyalty. "Dad, the faithful and discreet slave is God's channel. When we question them, we're questioning Jehovah himself. Maybe you need to pray harder and stop reading things that are confusing you." David's reaction was even more painful. He simply stopped returning my calls. When I asked Sarah about it, she reluctantly admitted that he'd told her he needed to protect his spiritual health by limiting contact with me until I came to my senses. My own son was shunning me, and I hadn't even been officially disfellowshipped yet. Emma, my daughter, tried to remain neutral at first. She would still talk to me, but our conversations became stilted and uncomfortable. I could sense her internal struggle between her love for me and her loyalty to the organization. Finally, she broke down during one of our phone calls. "Daddy, I don't understand what's happening. Everyone's saying you've become an apostate, that you're dangerous to be around, but you're still my father. You taught me to love Jehovah. How can you be bad now? I'm so confused and scared." That conversation shattered my heart into pieces. The organization was using my own children as weapons against me, forcing them to choose between family loyalty and organizational obedience. And they were choosing the organization just as they'd been programmed to do. The psychological pressure was relentless and sophisticated. I began receiving anonymous letters in my mailbox, scriptures about the dangers of apostasy, photocopied articles from Watchtower publications about faithful ones who had overcome doubts by submitting to the organization. Someone left a bound volume of Watchtower magazines on my doorstep with specific articles highlighted in yellow, all dealing with the consequences of questioning God's appointed channel. But the most disturbing discovery came when I realized they were monitoring my activities outside the Kingdom Hall. I found out purely by accident when I ran into Brother Foster at the public library. He seemed embarrassed to see me and mumbled something about researching a talk he was preparing. But I noticed he wasn't in the religious section where such research would logically take place. He was near the computers where I'd been doing my historical research. When I checked with the librarian later, she mentioned that several people had been asking questions about what I was reading and printing. The truth hit me like a sledgehammer. They weren't just isolating me socially, they were conducting active surveillance. Someone was assigned to track my movements, my research, my contacts. This wasn't just religious discipline. This was the behavior of a cult that would go to any lengths to protect itself from exposure. I decided to test my theory. I deliberately went to a coffee shop in a neighboring town where I'd never been before, choosing an obscure location at an unusual time. Within an hour, Brother Martinez from a congregation 20 miles away just happened to walk in. He seemed surprised to see me, made awkward small talk for a few minutes, then left without ordering anything. The coincidence was impossible to believe. That evening, I sat Sarah down for a serious conversation. Honey, I need you to understand what's happening to us. This isn't normal religious concern. They're watching me, following me, using our children against me. They're treating me like a criminal for asking honest questions about their teachings. Sarah looked exhausted, aged years in just a few months. Tom, maybe they're right. Maybe you have been influenced by Satan. Maybe you should just apologize, stop asking these questions, and get back to serving Jehovah faithfully. We were happy before all this started. Why can't we just go back to the way things were? Her words broke my heart because I understood her desperation. She was watching our entire world collapse and desperately wanted to return to the safety and security we'd known for decades. But I couldn't unknow what I'd learned. I couldn't pretend that false teachings were true, that harmful practices were. Loving that a controlling organization represented God's will. Sarah, I said gently, I can't live a lie. I can't stand up there and teach people things I know are wrong. I can't participate in a system that destroys families and controls people through fear. If that makes me an apostate in their eyes, then so be it. But I won't compromise my conscience to maintain their approval. The look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. I was losing her too. The organization had successfully driven a wedge between us, using her faith and fear to turn her against me. She still loved me, but she loved the organization more, and they were counting on that. As I looked around our living room, filled with Watchtower publications, convention badges, and photos from years of faithful service, I realized I was witnessing the systematic destruction of everything I'd built over nearly 3 decades. They weren't just removing me from positions of responsibility. They were erasing me from the community entirely, making me a cautionary tale for anyone else who might dare to think independently. But something unexpected was happening inside. Me too. With each act of surveillance, each manipulation of my family, each demonstration of their true character, my resolve was strengthening. I was beginning to see clearly what I'd been part of all those years. Not a loving religious organization, but a controlling cult that would sacrifice anyone who threatened its authority. And I was just getting started in learning how deep their cruelty could go. If you've made it this far in my story, I want you to know something important. You're not just reading about my experience. You're hearing the truth that the Jehovah's Witnesses organization desperately wants to keep hidden. They count on people not knowing what really happens to those who ask questions, who seek truth. Beyond their publications, who dare to think for themselves. Every person who hears these words is someone they can't control through ignorance. Please don't let this story end with you. Share it, discuss it, let others know what really goes on behind the loving facade they present to the world. Together we can break the silence that allows them to continue destroying lives. The formal investigation began in January 2020. I received a certified letter from the circuit overseer, Brother Kenneth Adams, requesting my presence at a shepherding visit with the body of elders. The tone was official, cold, nothing like the warm invitations I'd received countless times before when they genuinely wanted my input on congregation matters. This was a summons, and we all knew it. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at the Kingdom Hall. As I walked through those familiar doors, past the literature counter where I'd spent countless hours distributing Watchtower publications, past the bulletin board displaying my own name on various assignments just months earlier, I felt like I was entering enemy territory. The building that had been my second home for decades now felt hostile and unwelcoming. 5 elders sat in a semicircle facing a single chair, clearly designated for me. Brother Adams, a tall man with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, gestured toward the empty seat with the kind of authoritative gesture I'd seen him use in judicial committees, with congregation members facing serious spiritual offenses. Brother Anderson sat to his right, avoiding eye contact. Brothers Williams, Collins, and Martinez completed the intimidating panel. Brother Mitchell, Adams began, consulting a thick folder in his lap. We've received concerning reports about your recent conduct and statements. Multiple sources have indicated that you've been expressing doubts about fundamental teachings of God's organization, asking questions that undermine faith in the faithful and discreet slave, and possibly even reading apostate literature. These are serious allegations that require investigation. The word sources sent a chill through me. How many people had been reporting on my conversations, my questions, my research? How many friends and fellow worshippers had been secretly documenting my words and actions for this tribunal? Furthermore, Adams continued, we have reports that you've been seen at locations conducting research that appears designed to find fault with our biblical interpretations. Brother Foster observed you at the public library using computers to access materials critical of our chronology. Brother Martinez witnessed you in a coffee shop in Riverside, apparently meeting secretly with individuals outside our congregation. These behaviors suggest someone who is actively seeking to undermine his faith rather than strengthen it. I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment. They had been watching me, following me, treating me like a criminal under investigation. Brothers, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, visiting a library and drinking coffee are not spiritual offenses. I've been studying because I want to understand our teachings better, not to undermine them. And I wasn't meeting anyone secretly. I was simply getting coffee and happened to encounter Brother Martinez there. Brother Collins leaned forward, his expression stern. Tom, the issue isn't where you go or what you do. The issue is your motivation. Why do you feel the need to research our teachings using outside sources? Don't you trust that the faithful and discreet slave has provided everything necessary for our understanding? Why are you looking for contradictory information unless you're hoping to find problems with our beliefs? The circular logic was maddening but familiar. I'd used the same reasoning myself when counseling members who had raised questions about organizational policies. Any attempt to verify or understand teachings through independent research was automatically suspect, evidence of spiritual weakness or rebellious intent. I'm doing what the Bereans did, I replied, referencing the biblical example that witnesses often praised. They examined the scriptures daily to verify what they were being taught. Surely that's commendable, not condemned. Adams shook his head, impatiently. The Bereans were examining inspired scripture to verify the teachings of human apostles. We have the complete Bible today, and we have the faithful and discreet slave to help us understand it. Your situation is entirely different. You're using worldly sources to challenge spiritual food provided by God's appointed channel. For the next 2 hours, they systematically went through every question I'd raised, every doubt I'd expressed, every conversation I'd had with fellow elders about doctrinal concerns. They had compiled a detailed dossier of my spiritual decline, complete with dates, witnesses, and specific statements. The thoroughness was both impressive and terrifying. They confronted me about my questions regarding the 1914 chronology, my concerns about the blood doctrine, my doubts about their interpretation of the generation that would not pass away. Each inquiry was presented as evidence of apostasy, proof that I had allowed Satan to corrupt my thinking. When I tried to present the research I'd done, the historical evidence I'd uncovered, they dismissed it as worldly wisdom that contradicted spiritual truth. "Tom," Brother Anderson finally spoke, his voice carrying disappointment rather than anger. "I've known you for 15 years. I've watched you give powerful talks, conduct excellent Bible studies, help struggling families find their way back to Jehovah. That man seems to have disappeared, replaced by someone who questions everything, doubts the very organization that brought him to spiritual maturity. What happened to your faith?" His words stung because they contained an element of truth. I had changed. The unquestioning acceptance that had characterized my early years as a witness was gone, replaced by a critical examination that the organization couldn't tolerate. But I hadn't lost faith in God. I'd lost faith in men who claimed to speak for him. "My faith in God is stronger than ever," I responded, "but I can no longer have faith in an organization that claims infallibility while constantly changing its teachings, that demands absolute loyalty while refusing to answer legitimate questions, that destroys families in the name of love." The room fell silent. Brother Collins exchanged a meaningful look with Adams. I had crossed a line, spoken words that could not be taken back or explained away. In their minds, I had just confessed to apostasy. Adams closed his folder and folded his hands. "Tom, we're going to give you 2 weeks to reconsider your position. We want you to spend time in prayer, study our recent publications about loyalty to God's organization, and examine your heart to see if you truly want to remain one of Jehovah's Witnesses. When we meet again, we'll need to hear a clear repudiation of the doubts you've expressed and a commitment to accept the spiritual food provided by the faithful and discreet slave without question." As I left the Kingdom Hall that night, I realized I was walking away from everything I'd known for nearly 30 years, not by choice, but because the organization couldn't tolerate anyone who asked uncomfortable questions, who demanded evidence for extraordinary claims, who refused to check their conscience at the door of unquestioning obedience. The next morning, Sarah was waiting for me at the breakfast table with red-rimmed eyes. "Tom, Sister Anderson called me last night after you left the meeting. She said the elders are very concerned about your spiritual condition, that you might be heading toward disfellowshipping if you don't change your attitude. She said I needed to choose between supporting your rebellion or standing firm for Jehovah's organization." The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. They were forcing my wife of 4 decades to choose between her marriage and her faith, knowing that decades of organizational conditioning had taught her that the organization represented God himself. To oppose them was to oppose the Almighty. She said that if you get disfellowshipped, I shouldn't feel obligated to maintain normal marital relations with you, Sarah continued, her voice breaking. That my first loyalty should be to Jehovah and his organization, not to an apostate husband. Tom, I don't know what to do. I love you, but I can't fight against God. That phrase, I can't fight against God, revealed everything about their power. They had successfully convinced millions of people that they were God's representatives on earth, that opposing them was equivalent to opposing the creator of the universe. It was the ultimate trump card, impossible to argue against for someone who genuinely feared divine displeasure. Over the following days, the pressure intensified exponentially. My sons called separately, both delivering nearly identical messages that I suspected had been coached by the elders. "Dad, we love you, but we can't support you in fighting against Jehovah's organization. If you get disfellowshipped, we'll have to follow biblical guidelines and limit our association with you. Please don't force us to choose between you and our faith." Emma was more emotional, but equally firm. "Daddy, I've been studying the Watchtower articles about apostasy. The warning signs they describe match exactly what you've been doing. Questioning teachings, seeking outside sources, expressing doubts. I'm scared for you. Please just humble yourself, accept that you've been wrong, and come back to the organization before it's too late." The systematic destruction of my family relationships was proceeding exactly as they had planned. Each member was being forced to choose between their love for me and their fear of organizational disapproval. And the organization was winning. But something unexpected happened during those 2 weeks of reflection they had demanded. Instead of finding my way back to organizational loyalty, I discovered a peace I hadn't felt in decades. Free from the constant pressure to defend teachings I doubted, free from the obligation to present a facade of absolute certainty, I began to experience a genuine relationship with God for the first time in my adult life. I prayed more honestly than I had in years, not using the formulaic phrases I'd been taught, but speaking from my heart about my fears, my discoveries, my desperate desire to know truth, regardless of the consequences. I read the Bible without the filter of Watchtower publications, allowing the text to speak for itself rather than forcing it to support predetermined doctrines. What I found was a God of love and mercy who valued honesty over conformity, truth over tradition, conscience over compliance. The harsh, demanding deity of the Watchtower publications, who required absolute obedience to human leaders and threatened destruction for the slightest deviation from organizational loyalty, seemed like a counterfeit compared to the loving Father revealed in Scripture. I also began researching the experiences of other former Jehovah's Witnesses, reading accounts that mirrored my own journey from unquestioning faith to critical examination to organizational persecution. I discovered a vast network of people who had been exactly where I was, who had faced the same impossible choice between truth and family, who had paid the same devastating price for intellectual honesty. Their stories gave me courage and confirmed that I wasn't alone in my experience. The pattern was always the same. Questions led to surveillance, surveillance led to intimidation, intimidation led to ultimatums, and ultimatums led to the complete destruction of relationships with everyone the person had ever loved within the organization. But these former members had also found something beyond the destruction: authentic faith, genuine relationships, intellectual freedom, and the profound peace that comes from living according to conscience rather than organizational demands. They had rebuilt their lives on a foundation of truth rather than manufactured certainty, and many described their post-witness existence as far more fulfilling than their years of organizational servitude. As my 2-week deadline approached, I knew exactly what I would tell the elders. I would not apologize for seeking truth. I would not repudiate my questions or pretend to accept teachings I knew were false. I would not sacrifice my integrity on the altar of organizational unity. If that made me an apostate in their eyes, then I would wear that label with dignity, knowing that sometimes apostasy from error is the only path to truth. The final meeting took place on February 14th, 2020, Valentine's Day. How ironic that they chose the day celebrating love to destroy what remained of my family relationships. I arrived at the Kingdom Hall 15 minutes early, not out of eagerness, but because I wanted a few moments alone in the building where I'd spent so much of my adult life. The empty auditorium felt like a mausoleum, filled with the ghosts of countless meetings, assemblies, and celebrations that had once given my life meaning and structure. This time, 6 elders were present. They'd brought in Brother Jackson from the neighboring congregation and Brother Thompson from the circuit oversight team. The message was clear. This wasn't just a local matter anymore. Word of my apostasy had spread throughout the circuit, and they were taking no chances with containment. Brother Adams opened a leather-bound notebook and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement. Thomas Mitchell, after careful consideration and prayer, this judicial committee has determined that you are promoting apostate thinking within this congregation. You have repeatedly questioned fundamental teachings of God's organization, refused to accept correction from appointed elders, and shown a rebellious spirit toward the faithful and discreet slave. Today, we are giving you one final opportunity to repent of your apostasy and return to loyal submission to Jehovah's organization. The formality of it struck me as both impressive and absurd. Here were 6 men, most of whom I'd known for decades, some of whom I'd helped train for their positions, treating me like a dangerous criminal rather than a longtime friend who had simply asked uncomfortable questions. The elaborate judicial process was designed to make their decision appear divinely sanctioned rather than humanly motivated. Brother Jackson, whom I'd never met before this investigation, leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine concern. Tom, I've reviewed your case file extensively. Your track record of faithful service is impressive. 28 years as an elder, countless Bible studies, exemplary family life, regular pioneer work in your earlier years. Satan often targets our most dedicated members because their fall causes the greatest damage to the congregation. But it's not too late. You can still choose humility over pride, submission over rebellion. The psychological manipulation was masterful. By framing my questions as pride and rebellion rather than honest inquiry, they transformed intellectual integrity into a character flaw. By suggesting that Satan was using me, they made my doubt seem spiritually dangerous rather than rationally justified. And by emphasizing my past faithfulness, they implied that my current position was a betrayal of everything I'd once stood for. Brothers, I began, choosing my words carefully, I appreciate your concern for my spiritual welfare. But I need you to understand that my questions haven't come from pride or rebellion. They've come from a sincere desire to worship God in truth. When I discovered that our 1914 chronology is contradicted by every credible historical source, when I learned that our blood policy has changed dozens of times based on medical advances rather than scriptural insight, when I realized that our claim to be God's sole channel of communication is contradicted by our own history of false predictions and doctrinal reversals, I couldn't simply ignore these facts. Brother Collins interrupted sharply. That's exactly the problem, Tom. You're elevating human reasoning above divine revelation. You're trusting worldly sources over God's appointed channel. That's the definition of apostasy, placing your own understanding above the organization that Jehovah is using to direct his people. But how do we know they're God's appointed channel? I asked. Because they tell us they are. Every religious leader in history has made similar claims. Shouldn't there be some verification, some evidence beyond their own assertions? When the Watchtower Society has been wrong about the end of the world multiple times, wrong about medical issues, wrong about historical dates, wrong about biblical chronology, at what point do we acknowledge that they might not be infallible? The room fell silent. Brother Adams made notes in his leather journal. These weren't the words of someone seeking reconciliation with the organization. These were the words of someone who had moved beyond salvage, someone whose thinking had become too independent to be corrected through normal shepherding procedures. Brother Thompson, the circuit overseer, spoke for the first time. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. Tom, you're demonstrating exactly the attitude that led to Satan's rebellion in heaven. He thought he knew better than Jehovah. He questioned God's authority and convinced others to follow his thinking. Your questions might seem reasonable to you, but they're leading you down the same path that led to Satan's destruction. The comparison to Satan was meant to be devastating, and in my previous mindset it would have been. To be compared to the ultimate enemy of God was the worst possible accusation within witness theology. But instead of crushing me, it clarified something important. They had no rational response to my questions, so they were resorting to emotional manipulation and supernatural fear-mongering. If asking for evidence is satanic, I replied, then every scientist, historian, and scholar who has ever lived is following Satan. If wanting proof for extraordinary claims makes me rebellious, then I accept that label. But I won't pretend to believe things I know are false just to maintain your approval. Brother Anderson finally spoke, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine sadness. Tom, I've known your family for 15 years. I baptized your daughter Emma. I conducted your son Marcus's wedding ceremony. I've eaten countless meals at your table, shared vacations with you and Sarah, watched you grow in organizational responsibilities. It breaks my heart to see you throw all of that away for intellectual pride. Your family is being destroyed by your stubbornness. Is being right more important to you than preserving the relationships you've built over decades? His words hit harder than the others because they contained emotional truth mixed with manipulation. My family was being destroyed, not by my stubbornness, but by an organization that demanded they choose between family loyalty and organizational obedience. The real tragedy wasn't my questions. It was a system that couldn't tolerate questions without destroying the questioner. My family is being destroyed, I agreed, but not because I'm seeking truth. It's being destroyed because you've taught them that loving me and accepting organizational authority are mutually exclusive. You've created a system where honest questions are treated as betrayal, where intellectual integrity is viewed as spiritual danger, where family relationships are held hostage to enforce conformity. Brother Adams closed his notebook with finality. Tom, this committee has heard enough to make our determination. Your attitude shows no repentance, no humility, no willingness to accept correction from God's appointed elders. You've demonstrated that you've chosen worldly wisdom over spiritual truth, human reasoning over divine guidance. We'll announce our decision at this week's service meeting. I knew what that decision would be, but I asked anyway. What about my family? What specific instructions will you give them about their relationship with me? Brother Jackson answered with clinical precision. The scriptural guidelines are clear. Family members should limit association with disfellowshipped individuals to essential family business only. No spiritual fellowship, no social visits, no sharing of meals except in cases of emergency. This isn't punishment. It's loving discipline, designed to help the wrongdoer recognize the seriousness of their error and return to Jehovah's organization. And if I don't return, then your family will need to choose between their loyalty to you and their loyalty to God. We pray they'll make the right choice. The meeting ended with a prayer that felt more like a funeral service than a religious observance. Brother Adams thanked Jehovah for the wisdom to recognize apostasy, asked for protection for the congregation from my influence, and requested divine blessing on the difficult decision they were about to announce. I wasn't invited to add my own prayer. Apostates, apparently, weren't worthy to address the Almighty in the presence of faithful elders. As I walked out of the Kingdom Hall for what I knew would be the last time as a member, I felt an unexpected sense of relief mixed with profound grief. Relief because the pretense was finally over, because I no longer had to hide my questions or apologize for seeking truth. Grief because I was losing everything and everyone I'd loved for nearly 3 decades. The drive home was surreal. I passed familiar landmarks that suddenly felt foreign. The restaurant where we'd held congregation parties, the park where we'd conducted outdoor meetings, the homes of friends who would soon be forbidden from acknowledging my existence. In 30 minutes, I'd driven through the geography of my former life, a world I could see but no longer inhabit. Sarah was waiting in the living room when I arrived, her face puffy from crying. She didn't ask about the meeting. She knew from my expression what had happened. "When will they announce it?" she asked quietly. "Thursday night." She nodded and looked around our living room as if seeing it for the first time. 30 years of accumulated witness literature lined the shelves. Convention badges and assembly programs filled photo albums. Pictures of us with fellow elders and their families decorated the walls. Our entire identity as a couple had been built around our shared faith and organizational involvement. "What happens to us now, Tom?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I sat beside her on the couch, where we'd conducted hundreds of Bible studies with interested people, where we'd reviewed meeting parts and discussed spiritual goals, where we'd planned our lives around assembly dates and organizational activities. "I don't know, honey. They've given you an impossible choice. You can maintain a relationship with me and risk losing your standing in the congregation, or you can follow their guidelines and lose your husband. Either way, they win." She was quiet for several minutes, then spoke with the measured tone of someone who had already made a difficult decision. "Tom, I've been a witness for 36 years. It's not just my religion, it's who I am, my entire identity. All my friendships, my understanding of God and the future, everything I believe about right and wrong comes from the organization. I can't just throw that away, even for you. I'm sorry, but I have to choose my faith." The words I'd been expecting still cut through me like shards of glass, but I understood her decision because I'd helped create the mindset that made it inevitable. For decades, I'd taught people that the organization represented God, that questioning it was spiritual suicide, that loyalty to it trumped all other relationships. Now I was reaping what I'd sown. "I understand," I said, and I meant it. I helped build the system that's destroying us. I taught our children that organizational loyalty was more important than family unity. I can't blame you for believing what we've all been taught to believe. That night, I packed a suitcase with essentials and prepared to leave the house I'd called home for 22 years. Sarah had made her choice, and I had to respect it, even as it broke my heart. As I looked around our bedroom one last time, I realized I wasn't just losing a wife and home. I was losing my entire past. Every memory, every relationship, every achievement of my adult life was connected to an organization that was about to declare me dead to everyone I'd ever loved. But something else was beginning, something I couldn't yet fully understand. For the first time in decades, I was truly free to think, to question, to believe or disbelieve based on evidence rather than authority. The price was devastating, but the freedom was real. Tomorrow, I would begin learning what life looked like beyond the walls of the watchtower. The announcement came on Thursday evening, February 18th, 2020. I wasn't there to hear it, but Sarah called me afterward with a voice so broken I could barely understand her words. "It's done, Tom. Brother Anderson read your name from the platform. Thomas Mitchell is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses." The entire congregation went silent. People were crying. Sister Rodriguez grabbed my hand and whispered that she was sorry for our loss, like you had died. In their minds, I had died. The man who had served faithfully for 28 years, who had baptized dozens of people, who had conducted hundreds of Bible studies, who had given countless talks from that same platform, That man ceased to exist. The moment those words were spoken, what remained was a dangerous apostate, someone to be avoided at all costs, a cautionary tale about the consequences of independent thinking. The shunning began immediately and was more complete than I had anticipated. I had intellectually understood what would happen, but experiencing it was devastating beyond anything I could have imagined. My phone stopped ringing entirely. My email inbox, once filled with organizational announcements and friendly messages from fellow elders, became empty except for spam. The silence was deafening. I moved into a small apartment across town, partly to give Sarah space to process her grief, and partly because I couldn't bear living in the shadow of the Kingdom Hall, where I was now forbidden to enter. The apartment was furnished but sterile, lacking the warmth and memories that had filled our family home. For the first time in decades, I was truly alone with my thoughts. The isolation was crushing during those first weeks. I would wake up reaching for my phone to call Marcus about his job or Emma about her pioneering work, only to remember that those relationships were now forbidden. I would drive past congregation members at the grocery store and watch them literally turn their backs when they saw me, people who had hugged me just months earlier now, treating me like I carried a plague. But something unexpected began happening. As the weeks turned into months, the constant anxiety I'd carried for years, the pressure to have all the answers, to defend every organizational position, to maintain perfect spiritual appearances, began to fade. For the first time since my teenage years, I was free to explore ideas without fear of punishment, to read books without checking them against approved literature lists, to form opinions based on evidence rather than organizational directives. Discovered authors I'd never been allowed to read, historians who documented the real origins of biblical texts, scientists who explained evolutionary theory without the distortions I'd been taught, former religious leaders who had found the courage to speak truth about their experiences. Each book was like opening a window in a room that had been sealed shut for decades. Most importantly, I began connecting with other former Jehovah's Witnesses through online forums and support groups. These people understood my experience in ways that well-meaning outsiders never could. They had faced the same impossible choice between truth and family, had endured the same systematic destruction of their social networks, had wrestled with the same guilt and confusion that comes from leaving everything you've ever known. Through these connections, I learned that my experience wasn't unique or even unusual. The Watchtower organization had perfected a system for dealing with dissent that was both ruthlessly efficient and psychologically devastating. First, they isolated potential troublemakers through subtle social pressure. Then, they escalated to active surveillance and intimidation. Finally, they used the threat of complete social destruction to force conformity or exile. What struck me most was how many former elders were part of these support networks. Men who had served faithfully for decades, who had enforced the very policies that were now being used against them, who had genuinely believed they were serving God only to discover they had been serving a human organization that demanded divine loyalty. We shared a particular kind of trauma, the realization that we had been both victims and perpetrators of spiritual abuse. Through one of these online groups, I met Margaret Thompson, a former witness who had been disfellowshipped 15 years earlier for questioning the organization's handling of child abuse cases. She had rebuilt her life as a counselor specializing in religious trauma, and she offered to meet with me to discuss my transition out of the organization. Margaret lived about 2 hours away, and driving to meet her felt like crossing into a foreign country. She was in her 60s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that reminded me of the loving shepherds the organization claimed to produce, but rarely did. Over coffee in a small cafe, she shared her story of awakening, exile, and recovery. The Hardest part, she told me, isn't losing your faith in God. It's losing your faith in the people who taught you about God. When you discover that the men you trusted with your spiritual life were more concerned with protecting their organization than protecting the vulnerable, it shakes everything you thought you knew about authority, leadership, and truth itself. Her words resonated deeply because they captured something I'd been struggling to articulate. My faith in God had actually grown stronger since leaving the organization, but my ability to trust religious authority had been shattered. The realization that I had been manipulated for decades, that my devotion had been exploited to serve human interests disguised as divine commands, left me questioning every assumption I'd ever held about spiritual leadership. Margaret introduced me to other former witnesses in the area, people who had successfully rebuilt their lives after organizational exile. There was David, a former circuit overseer who now taught high school history and spoke openly about his experience with religious authoritarianism. There was Susan, a former pioneer who had become a nurse and found more genuine purpose in healing the sick than she'd ever found in converting people to the Watchtower. These people had something I hadn't seen in years of congregation life: authentic joy. They weren't performing happiness for organizational approval or maintaining spiritual facades for fear of judgment. They were genuinely content with lives built on their own values rather than imposed expectations. They had found freedom not just from the organization, but from the constant anxiety of trying to measure up to impossible standards. As my first year outside the organization progressed, I began to see changes in myself that were both liberating and unsettling. Without the rigid schedule of 5 meetings per week plus field service, I had time to pursue interests I'd forgotten I had. I started reading fiction again, something I'd abandoned as spiritually unproductive. I began taking long walks in nature without feeling guilty about not using the time for witnessing activities. I discovered music and movies that had been forbidden or discouraged during my witness years. But the most significant change was in my relationship with doubt and uncertainty. For decades, I'd been trained to fear questions and to seek absolute answers for everything. Now I was learning to be comfortable with mystery, to acknowledge when I didn't know something rather than forcing it into a predetermined theological framework. This intellectual humility felt foreign after years of claiming to have exclusive access to divine truth, but it was also deeply peaceful. The cost of this freedom remained devastating. Sarah filed for divorce in our 10th month of separation, citing spiritual endangerment as grounds. The legal proceedings were civil but heartbreaking as we divided up 30 years of shared life while barely speaking to each other. My children attended the hearing to support their mother, but they wouldn't make eye contact with me. I was still their father, but I had become a stranger to them. The property settlement was straightforward. Sarah kept the house and most of our shared possessions, while I took my personal items and enough money to start over. But the real division was less tangible and more permanent. She kept our shared history, our photo albums, our mutual friends, our established identity as a witness couple. I kept my integrity and my freedom to think, precious gifts that came at an almost unbearable price. As I signed the final divorce papers, I thought about all the couples I had counseled over the years, all the families I had helped navigate crises, all the marriages I had encouraged to persevere through difficulties. The irony wasn't lost on me that an organization supposedly dedicated to preserving families had systematically destroyed mine because I had asked uncomfortable questions about their teachings. But I also realized something else. I was not the same man who had walked into that first judicial meeting 2 years earlier. That man had been desperate to maintain organizational approval, willing to compromise his conscience to preserve his position. This man was comfortable with uncertainty, unafraid of difficult questions, and committed to truth regardless of the consequences. 2 years after my disfellowshipping, I received an unexpected phone call from my youngest son, David. His voice was shaky and nervous, and he spoke in whispers, as if afraid of being overheard. "Dad, I've been thinking about some of the things you said before everything happened. I've been doing some research on my own, and I'm starting to have questions too. Can we meet somewhere private? I need to talk to someone who understands what I'm going through." That phone call gave me more hope than I'd felt since this entire journey began. Not because I wanted my son to leave the organization. That decision had to be his own. But because he was thinking, questioning, refusing to accept easy answers to complex problems. He was demonstrating the intellectual courage that had cost me everything, but had also set me free. Today, 5 years after my disfellowshipping, I work as a volunteer counselor with people transitioning out of high-control religious groups. I help former cult members navigate the practical and emotional challenges of rebuilding their lives after organizational exile. It's not the ministry I planned when I first decided to serve God, but it feels more genuinely spiritual than anything I did during my 28 years as an elder. I want anyone hearing this story to understand something crucial. The Jehovah's Witnesses organization is not what it claims to be. Behind the loving facade and the promises of spiritual paradise lies a controlling system that demands absolute loyalty and destroys anyone who dares to think independently. They will tell you that questioning their authority is questioning God, that leaving their organization means losing eternal life, that your family relationships depend on organizational obedience. These are lies designed to keep you trapped in a system that benefits their leadership while controlling every aspect of your life. Real faith doesn't fear questions. Real truth doesn't require the suppression of doubt. Real love doesn't demand the destruction of family relationships to maintain organizational loyalty. If you're currently a Jehovah's Witness struggling with doubts, know that you're not alone and you're not going crazy. The questions you're afraid to ask are the same questions that thousands of others have asked before you. The research you're afraid to do has been done by countless former members who have found freedom on the other side of honest inquiry. The price of leaving is real and devastating. You may lose your family, your friends, your entire social network. You may face years of rebuilding your identity and learning to navigate a world you were taught to fear. But you will also gain something precious that no organization can give. You the freedom to think for yourself, to believe or disbelieve based on evidence rather than authority, to love and be loved without conditions. My name is Thomas Mitchell. I was an elder in the Jehovah's Witnesses organization for 28 years. I lost everything I thought mattered when I chose truth over comfort, integrity over approval, freedom over security, and I would make the same choice again. Because discovering who you really are is worth any price you have to pay to find it. The truth really does set you free, even when it costs you everything you once held dear.